Coming up on the program, I'll be speaking to the Liberal Senator Gary Humphries and Labor Senator Kate Lundy. First, though, joining me this morning on AM Agenda, the Shadow Minister for Finance, Senator Helen Coonan. Senator Coonan, thanks for your time.
Oh, good morning, Kieran.
First of all, before we get to your areas of responsibility, I want to ask you about Fiji. Will anything the government does on this matter influence the self-appointed military ruler Bainimarama?
Well, look, it's clearly a very difficult situation, but I don't think from the coalition's perspective we'd quibble with the action that the government has taken in expelling after the High Commissioner was expelled from Fiji, after our High Commissioner was expelled from Fiji, doing the same thing to Fijians, the Fijian acting High Commissioner, sorry, Kieran. But in circumstances as to what more pressure could be brought on them, I think it's very difficult because the more action that's taken, the more isolated Fiji becomes. Following the Pacific Islands conference, of course, Fiji has been excluded for not agreeing to hold elections. That is clearly what needs to happen. There needs to be a timetable for democratic elections to be held in Fiji, and perhaps another form of pressure that could be brought to bear that our spokesperson Julie Bishop has suggested just this morning is that the United Nations might be encouraged, perhaps in circumstances where the Fijian peacekeepers are used in UN missions, to withdraw them from that service, because that's obviously a key form of funding for the Fijian military. But it's a very serious and escalating situation, and we certainly agree with the tit-for-tat expulsion of High Commissioners.
This is not a murderous regime by any stretch. Does Australia, I mean, how bad is the Bainimarama regime? Does Australia have to be a bit careful not to go too far and hurt an already impoverished people as well?
Well, that's always the problem, isn't it, with sanctions? There's always a balance to be had. You always need to be careful that the action you take is proportionate, and you're quite right that while it may not be a murderous regime, I mean, people are suffering, and it is very important that what has happened in Fiji doesn't spread throughout the region. It's important, I think, in these circumstances that the pressure is kept up. But I agree that you have to be very careful that if you're going to withdraw support from Fiji in many respects, it's really the people who suffer. But you also have to be careful that you don't radicalise or further radicalise some elements there in Fiji. It's a serious situation, and the coalition is, as I say, doesn't take issue with the government's approach so far. Obviously there needs to be sanctions, but they need to be very carefully applied.
Before we get on to the economy, one other issue I want to get your thoughts on: the tragedy off the Cocos Islands, that boat that sank there. An investigation is going to be launched. Is there anything that the government could have done differently in this case, as far as you see it?
Well, look, going back a bit further, I mean, what the government clearly could have done is not unpick a policy setting that had been put in place that actually worked, where there was negligible pull factors that encouraged people to make these terribly hazardous journeys. Now, obviously, we don't quite know what the circumstances are of that particular boat, so I'm making my comment a much more broadly based one. But the situation here is that clearly the policy that the government is following has clearly failed. It's an absolute tragedy when lives are lost, and that is to be absolutely deplored. In circumstances where there was a policy that had stopped boats and stopped people taking risks with their lives, stopped encouraging people smugglers, it's pretty obvious that the Rudd Labor government has simply lost control of our borders. It's a very serious ongoing situation.
All right, onto the economy now. The Treasurer is going to give a speech today in which he points to some Treasury analysis which has found that the financial crisis has created a $42 billion hole in business investment. This will be used by the Treasurer, no doubt, to argue that the stimulus needs to remain in place. If that is the size of the hole in business investment by the GFC, surely some substantial stimulus needs to remain there.
Well, look, I think what we really need to do is to put it all in context. What the stimulus has done, of course, is to be stimulus of the kind that is promoted by public spending. I gather that what's really going to be talked about today may be relating to private investment, and of course there's a lot of factors that are going to encourage private investment other than continuing to prime the economy. Clearly what's happening here are circumstances where the Reserve Bank has moved on, and the Reserve Bank Governor, Mr Stevens, in the clearest of terms has said that there's simply too much stimulus in the economy and that it needs to be wound back. And yet you've got the government, on the other hand, still behaving as though they're saving the furniture, still pumping billions of dollars into an economy in circumstances where interest rates are now on the march, and that of course is feeding into some of the crowding out of the availability of funds for investors, and the economy going forward has to have a clear exit strategy from this excessive stimulus. We've suggested that it should be now, in these more resilient circumstances, should be wound back in a much more accelerated and targeted way.
You say that the rates are on the march, but you say that the rates are on the interest rates are on the march, but they're on the march from record lows, from what the governor describes as emergency lows. So you're making that comparison, but still, overall, rates are on an expansionary footing.
Well, one of the problems is, of course, the government can't have it both ways. Now, either you keep the rates very low, and that will obviously continue to encourage investment because rates will be much more affordable if the cash rate is low. But clearly the Reserve Bank sees the need to gradually raise the rates, while the government, on the other hand, is continuing to put pressure on how quickly those rates are raised and how high they go by continuing to have massive spending, and of course it's all borrowed money, and that's going to incur a lot more in interest payments.
But it's easy for the opposition, isn't it? It's easy for the opposition to be more bullish on this. When you look at I want to get your thoughts on the retail sales down for September, down 0.2% against expectations. They had been expecting retail sales to be up in September, and new approvals for private homes also flat. Doesn't that show an economy creeping forward as opposed to bounding ahead?
Well, nobody said that it's bounding ahead. What we've said is that quite clearly Treasury's gloomy forecasts in the budget were simply wrong. They were way out of whack, and we've seen in the MyEFO report released a couple of days ago that Treasury have still got quite a gloomy outlook, while the Reserve Bank has said that next year the economy will be close to trend growth. Now, in circumstances where you've got the monetary arm of policy moving in a direction where they're going to be raising rates, it makes no sense for the government to continue to be priming the economy. That is simply putting upward pressure on interest rates. It is reckless spending. It's going to make it even more difficult for small businesses, more difficult in circumstances going forward for them to continue to employ people and for them to be able to continue to actually grow their businesses. So the amount of stimulus in the economy has a very significant bearing on how quickly rates rise and how high they go. And the Governor of the Reserve Bank actually said that in a recent Senate inquiry, where he said theoretically if you took $30 billion out of the economy by way of stimulus still to roll out, well, obviously it could impact on being able to keep rates lower for longer. So you can't really have it both ways. If interest rates go up and there's pressure on the Australian dollar, obviously that feeds through to how effective business is.
Senator Helen Coonan, as always, appreciate your time on AM Agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kieran.
Stay with us after the break.